Hi everyone, you've seen my videos on render projections, render dieting, building out a studio, but it does you no good unless you have the Excel spreadsheets that I used in those videos. So I'll be publishing those spreadsheets, and we're going to be talking about that today on A Cup of Joe. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe, and when you click like on this video or comment, it gets it in more people's feeds and it really helps me out. So thanks. So it's time for the rubber to hit the road. It's time for me to take these Excel documents that you see in these videos and upload them to Google Drive for you to download and use for yourself. So I'll be doing that with a series of videos, including the 3 videos that I'll be doing in a series starting with this one. On my YouTube channel is going to be a playlist, and it's going to be all of the videos that have actual Excel files attached to them that I've uploaded to Google Drive. So in these videos, there'll be links to the Google Drive, and you'll be able to actually download the Excel spreadsheets that I'll be talking about in these videos and some of my past videos. So make sure you check out this playlist, and I'm going to assume that you've already seen a couple of videos before you've seen this. If you haven't seen my render projections video, I'm going to link to it right here. You want to make sure that you click on that first and watch that. I'm going to assume that you've watched that. I'm going to assume that you have the general principles in mind that I'm going to talk about in this video. I'm going to assume you know what a core hour is. And so if you don't, I'd really recommend you watch that video. There's some other videos in the playlist that I also think will be worth watching, but the render projections video one is going to cover a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, and there's no reason for me to talk about it twice. So go back and check that video if you haven't seen it yet, and let's move on to the next set that I'm going to do right now. Today's video is the first of a 3-part series on just render farm forecasting. We're going to cover in these 3 videos what was covered in that render projections video, but in much more detail, and I'm going to actually have the spreadsheets published for you to use yourself. The first one's going to be projections revisited. So we're going to talk about the basic principles of projections and review those. We're going to talk about top-down projections, bottom-up projections, and the staffing model projections. Then in the second video, we're going to dive into actuals. This is where you look at the results of how the week went on or the month and compare it to what you're projecting to help you with future decision making. And then finally, in the third video, we're going to talk about some other render strategies, such as frame counts, render efficiency curves, and other ways to erect fences on the render farm or create various silos and the benefits and the costs that come with those decisions. These 3 videos deal with render forecasting, but there's also disk space forecasting. It's the companion to all the render forecasting that has to happen. It'll happen in the same meetings, it'll happen in the same reports, but it is a slightly different process. So after these 3 videos, I will do a video exclusively on disk space forecasting, and it will follow this very same format. I'll probably compress it into one video though. Before we dive into the spreadsheets, there are some basic premises I always like to review. I like to make sure that everyone involved with render projections that I'm working with in a show or in a studio is all in agreement on these 5 principles, because if we're not, system's not going to work very well. So here's the 5 basic principles. The first one is that we must make the current tools and data work today. What I mean by that is we have to be pragmatic. Often in these conversations, people will let perfect be the enemy of success. And what I mean by that is people will talk about how the projection system or data collection system should be, all the data that we should be collecting, but we're not collecting. And then they'll use that as an excuse to not really dive into it. We really don't have all the tools and data, so what's the point sort of attitude. And the reality is the most basic data points will help you in the future if you can just start gathering them now. Even if it's just simple things like how much rendering took place in a month, and you just calculate that number. It's a broad number, but if you have 12 months of that data, now you've got a data set. So whatever the current tools and data that you have today to work with are what you have to work with, and you've got to make those work. 2 is that projections model human behavior, not machine activity. There's this idea that with all this rendering going on that you should be able to just apply some logic, throw things into an AI model, and somehow just figure out and predict what future rendering will be. But what a render farm really is sometimes hundreds, if not dozens of artists all making individual decisions on how big to make things, how wide, the zoom is, or bounding boxes, and all kinds of various choices that will affect the rendering times. And that's human choice, man. That has nothing to do with computers deciding how to do things, and so therefore they run in a predictable manner. So as a result, it's as wildly and crazy as the stock market. And if I could predict human behavior on the render farm, well, I'd take it over the stock market and I'd be rich. But that's the reality, is you're modeling human behavior when you're predicting the render farm and disk projections. 3, there's always going to be uncertainty, but projections are going to be needed early and often. Now, there's going to be a tendency for people to throw their hands up and say, we just can't figure it out. But the last thing you want to put into a spreadsheet is a question mark or a 0 where there should be your best guess. Now, your best guess might be wildly off, but you can change that guess as the show progresses. But you want to start with the studio's best guess or the supervisor's best guess. It's way better than putting in 0 into any projection. 4, please remember that production is generally only concerned on a day-to-day basis with overnight throughput. So you can talk about strategy, you can talk about projections and actuals, but the reality is if artists are coming in the morning and they're feeling like they're not getting their work that they submitted overnight, all your numbers don't really mean a lot. It's all about perception, and that's a big part of the perception game. So you've got to factor in those perceptions when you're talking about your numbers, or else you could sort of created an imbalance between what you're projecting and what people are experiencing on the farm. And 5, digital producers, digital production managers, and the show supervisors are the primary forecasters. You cannot rely on your IT manager or some resource manager or your render wranglers to create a projection for you. They can often create a lot of the framework for you to come up with your best guesses. They can often help you gather the data and run the tests so that you can make good, accurate projections. But in the end, the judgment and the time has to be put in from the show itself. And I've never been into a studio where that wasn't true. One more thing before we dive into these spreadsheets. You're going to need to know a little bit of Excel to make this work. Excel is not super complicated, but it is something you have to learn how it works. It's like any Microsoft Office product. It's not 100% intuitive. But the reality is you need to know a little bit of Excel. You can take these and bring these into Open Office, or you can take these and bring these into Google Docs. They might look a little different, but the basic Excel foo, if you will, is all the same across all of them. And this is some basic Excel stuff here. I didn't throw in too many complex tools. It's mostly just adding and dividing and basic algebra and arithmetic. So hopefully this doesn't overwhelm you, but we're going to start with the staffing-based estimates. And the reason we start with the staffing-based estimates is often a show doesn't know exactly what kind of render footprint it's going to have when they're bidding the show, but they usually have a good sense of what kind of staff they're thinking for a show. And so they can take those basic staff assumptions and plug them in. Now, in all of these spreadsheets, I've tried to make a sort of this orange color where you have to put in data. So this is where a human is going to input the data, and then everything else should be calculated automatically. I chose these 5 roles. You might have different roles on your show. You can add or remove the roles as you see fit. And I just imagined, these are all imaginary numbers, a general small crew on a show that's not too massive, right? You can see here that the numbers start to grow as the year wears on, week after week. We start to see more and more lighters and modelers and all that. That's basically a simple spreadsheet of staffing. This is usually in the hands of any bidding producer. They should have some document that either looks like this or can be conformed to this. Now, one thing, if you don't have the historical data of the render farm, one thing you usually can figure out is how many render machines or cores did the studio have to get this work done last time. In other words, take the last couple of shows that they completed, if any, hopefully, and say, okay, how many machines on the farm was the peak? Let's just say the peak was 100, or say it was 50. Okay, whatever that number is. Okay, what was the artist footprint at that time? And then what you have to do is sort of ration out in a way that makes sense to you and to the CG supervisors or show supervisors how it was doled out. And what I mean by that is if a modeler had the way I always like to say it to a soup is imagine an artist had a couple of machines at their desk that they could use to render all day long, and how many machines would they need at their desk extra to get a day's work done? And so a modeler, they might say, oh, they just need like a half a machine. You know, modelers aren't really rendering a lot at best. Same with rotoscope. Maybe they're not doing massive renders. You know, a half a machine at best. But lighters, you know, lighters probably need something like 5 machines that by the time they come in the morning, all their frames are done. And they might say the effects artists, they too need 5 machines each to run all those sims and rendering. Maybe the compositors only need 2 machines per compositor because historically, compositing frames are a little faster, although that's changing these days with volumetrics. For the most part, that's an assumption you can make. And whatever that total is, it just needs to total up, hopefully, to the machines you had in the past. So you come up by looking at some past shows and sit down with the soups and say, okay, let's just assume if you got to say, you know, this many artists, these 30 or 40 artists had these 100 machines, how would you dole them out? And whatever that final number needs to do, it needs to add up to 100, right? You're just thinking of it as like food rations almost. And you know that a lighter is going to get more food rations than a rotoscope person if food is rendering in this case. So this is a general kind of benchmark you can set up, and it can change over time. So if you're not collecting any data from the shows, and you don't have any historical render data, and you're not collecting render data going forward, you likely have a staffing history, and you likely know how big the farm got. So you should be able to then look at the next show and say, hey, in reality, we had to add some machines because everyone was complaining. So in fact, it is taking now 7 machines per lighter, or 5 instead of 5 machines for effects artists. It's really taking 8. And so you can adjust these numbers and then use these for future forecasting. It's super broad. It's not very accurate, but at least it lets you know that if you have so many artists coming in, that you can have so many machines available to them that will match up. So you're forecasting the farm to match the staffing footprint. I used machines in this sense. If you're using cores, which I strongly recommend, you think of your render farm as cores, or if you have machines of different sizes, you especially want to think of them maybe as cores. And in this case, I just assigned, it's the same ratio, but in this case, it was cores per artist. And you could just look at your farm and say, okay, we've got so many hundreds of cores. We have so many dozens of artists. How would we divide these up if we were rationing them out? And when you do that, again, you can see here, if we look at the graphing that data, whether it's the machines or the workstations that the artist might need, because the workstation head count is basically the artist head count, right? So out of this list, you can also forecast your artist workstations you might need. But really what you're looking for here is how many farm machines are you going to need, or farm cores if you're using cores. And now you might say, okay, well, we know that we're going to need 70 of these farm machines for this show if we're going to match up with this staff. And then you're going to go look at your farm and say, okay, well, how many machines do we have? Because if you've got 30 machines on your render farm, well, this isn't going to work, is it? And if you've got 200 machines on your render farm, well, this job is going to sail through just fine. You're going to be able to bring this show in, and it's going to have all the farm in the world. The other reason you want to have a staffing projection, even if you're doing very detailed projections, is it allows you to check your more detailed render projections against your staffing render projection and see that there's some parity, that they match. If you see a huge mismatch, like you don't expect the show to ramp up for months, but you've got a staff that's in-house and hired, then you might want to figure about bringing in that farm a little earlier. Assume that your farm's going to ramp up a little early. So you always want to compare your staffing forecast against your more detailed forecast that we're going to talk about coming up here next. So that brings me to that next conversation is, well, let's stop looking at the staffing or the projections and say, we got to know how big is our farm. So looking at our farm size here, you can see that we've got 50 workstations. They're just 12 core machines, and they're really only up for the 12 hours of the weeknights. And then on the weekends, you get them for the whole weekend. But they're not always there, but you always want to have them in your farm because they can add a lot of needed capacity. And then the majority of this farm really comes out to be these new render nodes, the AMD 7662. I used examples of ones that we're currently deploying in our Studio Cloud. So these are 128 core machines. That's right. Every machine has 128 cores. cores. And so, you can pack a lot of cores in. That's why, again, I suggest you look at cores more than machines. And then, of course, we have the classic Intel 6240 on the Intel side, which it too brings a good hefty package of cores. And so in this farm, you can see they've got around 110 hosts or machines. They've got 176 cores, and then they have the core hours per week. Now, I talked about this in my last video. If you just take the total amount of cores that you have for each hour. So if you multiply these out by the number of hours in the week, you get to how many core hours they have per week and how many core hours they have per month. Again, if you're not sure what a core hour is, you might want to go back to the original render projections video in this playlist and watch that, where I go into how to deal with core hours. But now you've done this exercise, you know how many machines you have in your farm. And if you went back and looked at your staffing model, you'd see, hey, we've got for hosts, we've got 50 workstations, and we've got around 110 machines total on the farm. And when I look how many machines we need, well, looks like we need around 50 or 60 machines on the farm. We need around 25 artist workstations. So right off the bat, you can tell that we're probably okay, assuming this is the only show that the studio is doing. But now let's look at a show. We now have to put some basic information about this show that we're trying to forecast. And this is going to come down to some basic information: easy, medium, and hard shots. How many are there and how many frames? If you don't know how many frames are going to be, the average visual effects shot is around 90 frames. There's great variance in there. If it's a very fast action movie, those are going to be much shorter average frames per shot. And if it's like a Steven Spielberg film where they're going to be slightly longer shots, well, then you're going to start seeing 120 or 130 frames per average. But 90 frames is always a good average to start with until you know better. And let's assume that we're going to be getting an opening shot awarded on this, which is going to be a long single shot of 150 frames long. So you've got that one big shot that's coming up, and I'm going to talk about that one a little later. Next, we've got delivery dates. You've got your shot creation date. You've got your final delivery date. And there's usually a couple of interim delivery dates. This could be for friends and family screenings, or where they're going to have some specific trailer coming out. So you need to keep in mind those particular interim delivery peaks. Now, once you punch that in, you're going to see these next two columns, which I'm getting ahead of myself here because we're going to talk about how we got to those numbers in just a moment. But you do have your summary over there where you can see the total weeks and the total number of shots now that you've got ahead of you. It's never linear, so you don't just do a number of shots per week or something like that, because in the beginning, very few shots will be getting done. And at the end, there'll be lots of shots getting done. But this gives you a general sense that you've got 52 weeks to do 72 shots. That's really not a lot to ask of a visual effects studio, but that's the numbers we're using for this model. Now let's take a look at the top-down model. Now this only works if you've been storing your historical render data in a database. I can't recommend this enough, that you make great efforts to collect all of your render historicals and keep them in a time series database. This allows you to look at a specific shot or a specific time frame and say, what was the consumption of our farm? This allows you to then project in the future. Admittedly, a 5-year-old show doesn't always help you project the future, but needless to say, having this data set is extremely important. So let's assume you do have this data set, and you go back and you look at, you say we have some easy shots, medium shots, and hard shots. The easy shots can be very similar to these three old shows, old show 1, 2, and 3. There's specific shots. Usually the supervisors who've been around the block a few times at the studio, they know about the history, and they'll go, yeah, it's going to be the same like this old show. We did shot AB 12, this old show CD 34. Maybe they look through the daily systems, try to find some old comparative shots, and then you're going to extract from that how many core hours did it take to get that whole shot done, whole kit and caboodle, front to back. And then it's going to be, well, how many frames were that shot? And then finally, you're going to punch in how many core hours per frame. Assuming you have kept good historicals, you're going to go back and your CG supervisor or show supervisors going to look at these easy, medium shots, and they're going to try to find shows or shots in the past that were representative of the type of work you're doing now. So usually a soup that's been around the block a few times at a studio can look back and say, okay, I remember old show 1, we did this shot, AB 12. Maybe they can pull it up in an old daily system and take a look and say, okay, this shot here took so many core hours. It was so many frames per shot. And then you're going to find, usually I try to suggest at least 3 examples per category. And then at the end, you're going to actually have the number of core hours per frame. That's important because different shots have different frame lengths. And if you're trying to pull out the averages, it's not just the average per shot, but it's the average per frame. In animation, the frame-based thought process is much more developed. In VFX, people often fall back on the per shot numbers, but I can't stress enough, you want to look at the core hours per frame averages. You're going to do the same thing for the mediums, where you're going to go and say maybe they found all these shots from old show 1 that were very comparable to the medium work, and then the hard work, they found old show 3, they took some shots, they took these big core hour numbers, divided across these short frame counts, and said, okay, it's going to be so many core hours per frame. And then you want to come up with an average. You might want to eliminate the outliers if you've got more than 3. It's really best to have 5 or 6, then you pull out the outliers, but 3 is good enough, I always say. And then the opening shot, like I talked about earlier, maybe they went back and found some old work from an old show. They said, you know, it's going to be a lot like this show. And so they figure out the per core hour frames. But again, that opening shot's 850 frames. So it's going to be a lot of core hours for that one single shot. This points out why I never want you to focus on the per shot averages. It's always about the per frame averages. This is the top-down projection. This assumes, again, that you have historicals that you can punch in. You can do this at the earliest stages of the show when you simply have those basic bidding numbers that I talked about, where you just know how many easy, medium, and hard shots you have. Sometimes there'll be 5 or 6 categories. You'll have super easy and very, very hard. However you, the show, want to categorize them, that's fine. But for each category, you got to go find some averages. The other way you could do this is bottom up. Now, bottom up doesn't matter whether or not you have historical averages or not. The bottom up projection is where a show actually takes shot work and breaks it up into very detailed expectations. This is similar to what I talk about in the rendered diet video, where you go through and budget how much you expect each shot to take per artist. And then if artists start to stray outside of those standards, well, then you can reassess whether or not you've budgeted enough. But needless to say, you can go through and break up a shot into all the steps that you would imagine for the shot to be in your particular pipeline, and then add up how many cores, how many minutes per frame. You enter in all this information, the iterations, the category, the job type, the frame counts that you expect. Sometimes there's shorter frame counts on effect shots if they're going to be just a little portion of a shot. The cores you're allotting, you'll notice that you put a lot more cores to those big lighting renders than perhaps some early modeling dailies. The minutes per frame, you want to get in some estimates. Now, the way you come up with these estimates is, again, you can look at historicals, but in a more detailed way, where you actually look at each individual shot, or you can run tests. This is what's more commonly done. So Soups will run some basic tests, and then they'll extract assumptions from that. Again, these assumptions in the beginning are going to be way off, but as the show progresses, you can revisit these assumptions and say, let's change them because it turns out we were too high or too low. But this is a great place to start with the bottom up. This will get you generally a better projection of a show than top down. Top down is just some basic assumptions you're making about the total number of shots. When you do the bottom up, I again only use the easy, medium, and hard categories, but I've seen shows maybe create 5 or 6 or even 8 categories where they go over the basic shots, and then they'll have 5 or 6 money shots that they break out individually. So they're actually just doing this whole process for an individual shot. Again, these are usually the money shots. For instance, I used, here's the example, the opening shot, right? This is a single shot that you then need to take all those assumptions, multiply them out by 850 frames, and you'll see that you get a huge number, 1.8 million core hours just for this one single shot. Now, finally, we get to the show projection worksheet. Now, this is where the digital resource manager or the IT manager or the producer gets to be a little bit of an artist. And what they're going to do is they're going to draw a curve that's going to match the best guess of the show curve. Now, here's what I mean by that. Now, you've taken a top-down projection, you've taken a bottom-up projection, and you can take those numbers and plug them in to a spreadsheet. Now, you notice if we go back to the show directory, I talked about these total number of core hours. The top-down or the bottom-up projection each generated their own number of core hours. Regardless of which one you decide to go with on your show and you think is more accurate, you can look at that as the total budget that your show is going to be spending. So if we go back to the show projection page, when you add up all the weeks of projections, they should total up to those numbers. So whether you spend it all in the beginning or all at the end, which is what most shows do, you're going to need to spread out that 26 or 16 million across all those weeks. I mentioned this in the last video. We're talking about creating the bucket of hours, right? Or the bucket of core hours that you need to spread out over the show. Now, this is a whole year, so we're going to spread it out quite a bit. But I can tell you some general principles that in the last 1/3 to 1/4 of the show's schedule, there will be anywhere between 40 and like 80% of the rendering. It depends on how your show is set up. If you are the kind of studio, the kind of show that tends to bunch up at the end, deal with problems, and let other shows sort of take their resources a little longer than they thought, and you end load the shows, then you want to put a lot of high percentages at the end of the pay period. This is what I mean by that. You notice I have the percent distribution here. And what I've done here is put what percent of that total budget I think is going to be spent every week until we get to the final delivery. In the beginning, I'm expecting very little to be spent, 0.25% of the budget per week. Then as time goes on, we get to 0.5%, meaning of that total render budget, we're going to start getting into the 0.5%. Then we're going to get into the 1%. Then we're going to get towards the end, it gets up to 2%, 3%. We're using 5-6% of the budget per week, all the way out to where we get up to the high of 7%. Now, however you spread out these percentages, and it's an art form, this is where you want to look at your show and your studio's historical curves and say, are they very tepid, mild curves like you see in animation, where after a few months, it's just a flat curve where the same amount of rendering is done every single week? Or is it a visual effects show where it tends to ramp up more and more and more until the end where it's just out of control, especially if there's a lot of high-end effects? You have to decide that as a producer or as a resource manager. This is the artistic part of the job. And you need to start by drawing a curve using these percentages. And then what comes out is a curve. And I'm going to show that curve here. It's this curve right here. Now, what I've done is I've put in different projections. I put in the top-down and bottom-up projection. I put in a very detailed projection, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And when you punch in all of these, which you want to track them all if you can, you'll see a graph that looks similar to this. And this is all the projections lined up. You'll see there's some similarities between them all. You'll see that the projection for top down and bottom up took into account those two interim deliveries and allocated a little more during those particular periods of time. The detailed one is not yet accounted for that, but the detailed one shows more use over the period of time and less peaks at the end. So how you distribute these two numbers for the top down and the bottom up is, again, a little bit of an art form. Now, you can do this based on the show schedule. So if you have in Shotgun already a general show schedule, it's likely going to match this. If you know you're doing twice as many shots towards the end of the show, well, then you're going to probably have twice as much rendering towards the end of the show, right? So this is why I say the producer or the digital resource manager paints this curve, not arbitrarily, but based on the knowledge of the scheduling of the show, other competing shows, maybe the delivery of new procs, whether or not they'll even be farm available in the early part of the show. So this is a very subjective part, but whatever this does, it has to add up to 100%, because you're taking 100% of all the core hours that have been projected for that show and spreading them out like a budget across an entire show period. In this case, it's a year. I talked about that a lot in the last video. I hope this makes sense to you. And this is the document that I would use to do that. And again, the graph is tied to this document, and it will show you all of the projections that you've done and whether or not they match up. You can also put your staffing projection on here if you want and see how that matches up. And you'll see when you get zoomed in, you'll see that there's significant differences. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the actuals in video 2. Finally, there's a detailed show projection. What does this mean? This is where every single shot gets listed in a spreadsheet. So rather than just saying medium, hard, and easy, you actually go through and list every shot, FF01, shot FF02, however you set up your shot codes. And this usually forms directly to, say, a shotgun staffing schedule or a shotgun show schedule, and where you're saying which shot are we going to be running each week. In this case, I took the projection for each shot and stretched it over 3 weeks, because generally, that was an assumption I used to make, was an average shot will take 3 weeks of heavy rendering on the farm. So you can break this up however you want, but this is something I'd say maybe 5% of shows actually get to the stage. I wish every show would get to the stage where a digital production manager or a digital producer would take the time to figure out for every single shot, where is it on the schedule, and then using the averages that the CG supervisors came up with, what's our actual render curve? This can often be the most accurate, or at least the one that the shows take the most ownership of. And again, if we go back to that graph I did, you'll see that it is the gray line in this particular graph. And you'll notice again that it starts up a little earlier and it has more granularity to it based on a show schedule. And it doesn't have the huge peak at the end that the top-down and bottom-up ones would assume. And again, they would assume that because they're painting it. And if I was doing it, I became pretty cynical, and I would generally assume the show was going to be end loaded until it could prove early on that it wasn't going to be end loaded. And again, we'll talk about that more in actuals. So the detailed show projection, as you can see, is a very detailed document where every single shot is accounted for in a single spreadsheet, and it all gets added up at the top, so you can come up with a how many core hours do we need per week for this show. This would be the best way to go about it, with each shot being individually assessed, or at least grouped, into some fairly granular groups, so that you can not just paint everything with a broad brush. Now, finally, when you take these numbers and you have this show projection, now you're going to have one of these for every show. You're going to take what's the most recent version of the projection. You'll notice this one started a little later because the detailed one usually doesn't start up in the beginning. It takes a little while for the shows to get to this point. But needless to say, you're going to take the most detailed projection you have, the most recent projection you have, and you're going to put that into the studio projection document. And that's where I pasted in show 1 up here at the top. You'll see here that show 1 is not alone. Show 1 also has show 2 and show 3, and hopefully we're going to bring in a show 4, and there's always that 911 show and the commercial project and everything else that comes in. And so what you're doing here is you're lining up all the core hours for all the shows, and then you're adding it up to a projected total. And you're saying, okay, here's the total amount of core hours we expect week over week for every show. And then you're going to say, okay, well, what's the capacity? Again, you're going back to that original farm size document. How many core hours do we actually have every week or for any particular period of time? And then the question is, do we have a surplus or a deficit? This is not much different than if you're spending money every week, right? You're saying, okay, well, we're going to be spending a lot more money during these weeks, and we don't quite have enough in the budget to handle it. This is where you want to start looking at, do we need to get in more farm? Now, this graph is exactly the graph data that I was just showing you in this spreadsheet. This is basically saying, here are the shows stacked on top of each other. Show 1 is this very large orange show, and show 2 is this small blue show layered on top, and show 3 is this other goldenrod color. Another small show that's happening a little later after show 2. But they're all going to be coming up towards the end of the year, ramping up, and you're not going to have enough farm. The red line is, of course, capacity is the farm. I've done this exercise at many studios, and anyone who's worked with me has probably seen this graph. This is the end discussion, right? Do we have enough farm at this studio to handle this work? Now, well, you might look at this and say, absolutely not. You need to double the size of your farm. But like I've talked about in other videos, it's difficult to just say we want to have double the farm. At the CDW Studio Cloud, we do often meet that request, and we'll offer shows double the farm, and it happens, but it comes at a huge cost, right? What happens more often is the show will say, okay, well, how can we get that peak down, or how can we do work earlier in the year so that we're not using all that capacity at the end of the year, right? And this is the analysis you want to go through, and this is an iterative analysis where you're going to go back through this document, and it's the reason why I put so many versions on here. You might, by the the end of a year-long show, have projection 8, projection 10, projection 12. It should be a constant iterative process where, at least once a month or so, there's a new projection. The game always changes. We get it. It's important, though, that you're tracking your projections, that you're doing your projections, and it's okay if they're way off, because on month 2 and month 3, when you look at your actuals, which we're going to talk about in the next video, and this is the whole idea. You don't always have all the information up front. You have to make some broad assumptions. But if every month you're going through and iterating and creating a new version of projections, you're going to be steering a little to the left, then you're going to steer a little to the right. And by the end of this show, you're going to be steering right down the middle of the road, and you're going to get this show to deliver. And that's what the projection system is about. It's all about embracing this cone of uncertainty and then working it further and further out until the cone becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. By the time you get to the end of the show, you're sailing on home with very accurate projections, and what you're seeing at the end of every week matches very much what you're predicting. That's the best case scenario. Like I said at the beginning, this document is linked now in Google Drive, and there's a link in the description, so you can actually download this Excel file, open it yourself, feel free to play with it, own it. I'm leaving it for everybody to play with as they see. If you see some inaccuracy, or you see some way to improve it, or you have some cool idea, feel free to send it back to me or reach out to me. You can always hit me up at this email address right here, and we can have a little dialogue back and forth. I'd love to hear your ideas. I wish I finished finite math and calculus in college, because I'd probably do a better job on this spreadsheet. There's a lot of manual operations that I do because that's the limit of my math. But I bet you there's a bunch of smarter people out there listening to this video right now. So feel free to add your 2 cents to this document, or any of the documents that I post. Send it back to me. And hey, if it's something I think worthy, I might even do another video highlighting the changes. So there we go, everybody. I hope you found this useful. Hope you find this series useful. Check out number 2. It's going to be a little shorter, and number 3 will be shorter still. We'll continue going through this document. The next layer we're going to be adding now, again, in the next video, is actuals. So let's move on to that video next on A Cup of Joe. Thanks, everybody.